Hello, this is Jason from Liberate Raleigh, and this is another Liberate Raleigh video. The topic of this video is going to be something that gets promoted within the libertarian movement quite frequently, and that is political decentralization. This usually takes the form of maybe national governments stepping out of international organizations like maybe the UN, or reducing their involvement in those things, or secession movements, or things along those lines, which move the state structure from being one of a larger state down to smaller states, maybe moving them from larger areas to governing smaller areas. And in the libertarian movement, it seems like, and this has been my experience for many years, at least for like the last nearly 20 years, it seems like political decentralization has become an end in and of itself, as if political decentralization is a self-justifying end, that no matter what the circumstances, political decentralization should be supported by libertarians merely because it's political decentralization. I believe even Rothbard, in one of his essays, stated that libertarians should support the smaller, more local state against the larger, less local state. Like, say, for example, one of the states in the United States against the larger national federal government, even when that smaller state is not necessarily promoting libertarian rights, or may even be violating those rights. So it seems like this is considered an end in and of itself. And for many years, I just sort of accepted this. In fact, up until very recently, I would say that I almost uncritically accepted this. But recently I've been mulling this over and thinking about these things, and I think that it's not quite as apparent as it is made out to be. So I'm going to kind of analyze this idea of political decentralization and kind of try to figure out whether it's a good thing, a bad thing, or what the story is. So I think there are two main ways of looking at this that are relevant. There's the ethical way and the practical way. So what I mean by the ethical way is examining political decentralization from the standpoint of libertarian ethics, libertarian political ethics. And by that, I mean the principles of self-ownership and private property. So that's the first way. And the second way is sort of when I say practical standpoint, I mean, well, maybe political decentralization will make it more likely that libertarianism can spread and win out, and maybe through political decentralization the state can be reduced, maybe not necessarily from, even if the ethical standpoint doesn't wash out, maybe there are practical reasons to support political decentralization in that. Again, it just simply makes it more likely for the state to be less tyrannical, or makes it more likely for libertarianism to spread. So those are the two main ways I'm going to look at this. And again, I'm simply going to be looking at political decentralization in and of itself, just the entire principle, because again, my impression is this is automatically accepted as a good thing within the libertarian movement, and I simply want to analyze this idea from those two perspectives. So the first way of looking at political decentralization is, again, from the standpoint of ethical justification, or the libertarian theory of private property ethics. And what I mean by this, again, is the typical libertarian idea of self-ownership and private property, wherein you own yourself in the sense that you have control over your body, and you own or have control over that property which you have either homesteaded, unowned property that was homesteaded by you, or any property which you have acquired via voluntary transaction. So this is the basis for libertarian political ethics that I'm going to look at political decentralization through. So what is political decentralization? Well, it's when, like I said, one smaller state or a more local state disassociates from a larger, or a state that covers a larger geographic region. This became a hot topic with the United Kingdom leaving the European Union, otherwise known as Brexit. And so once Trump was elected, there were people, were even left-leaning people, talking about states like California seceding from the Union, from the United States. So this has been kind of a hot topic over the last year or so. But let's look at this from the standpoint of libertarian ethics. What we know from this is that no state has any legitimate authority over anybody, and that by forcing people to live under its rule, it is violating their rights. So this is true whether the state is more local or less local, or whether it is a large state or a smaller state. The mere fact that it's a smaller state governing an area and a group of people, it simply does not follow that that state is necessarily violating their rights and violating less of their rights. Another thing is, it seems like a lot of even libertarians seem to consider the act of political decentralization as people coming together and voluntarily choosing to disassociate from the larger state. So, for example, even I believe the Brexit was subject to a referendum vote. So here it would seem obvious that this is a case of people voluntarily choosing to disassociate with the European Union. And the problem is that this only tells half the story. That is not what political decentralization entirely entails. What it also entails is that, well, yes, the larger state, in the case of Brexit, the European Union, no longer has authority over a certain group of people. That authority is being taken over by the smaller state. So it's not a case of people voluntarily choosing to disassociate with a larger state. What it comes down to is a shift in authority from the larger state to the smaller state. So in the case of Brexit, the United Kingdom decided to because it wasn't always in the European Union, it decided to retake certain areas of authority which had previously been subject to the European Union. So what does this tell us? Well, first of all, we know that this authority is illegitimate. We know this based on libertarian ethics. Neither the United Kingdom or the European Union has the legitimate right to exercise this authority over the group of people living within the United Kingdom. So the mere fact that this authority has shifted from the European Union to the United Kingdom does not create a net gain as far as freedom or a reduction in the violation of rights of the people living within that area. So we can't conclude that from an ethical standpoint, that political decentralization leads to a reduction in the violation of people's property rights. It would seem that the most reasonable standpoint here is to look at it from a neutral standpoint. It may be the case that there will be fewer rights violations, but it could also be a case where there will be more rights violations which will be committed by the smaller state. Just the mere fact that the smaller state is disassociating from the larger state doesn't tell us anything about the nature of that change, or the nature of the changes, the nature of the changes relating to the oppression of that group of people by that smaller state. That must be done. You have to look at the individual circumstances, it would seem. So we simply can't conclude that from an ethical standpoint, political decentralization is a positive from a libertarian perspective. It may or it may not. So to have this this idea that political decentralization should, in and of itself, be supported and promoted simply does not pass the ethical standard. It simply does not hold up to it. What it ultimately comes down to is a mere shift in authority from one state to another, neither state having the legitimate authority to act over those areas of authority, and therefore there is no net gain to freedom or liberty. Simply meet the new boss, same as the older boss, in the case of Brexit. So again, from an ethical standpoint, it would seem that the correct libertarian position is neutrality. So since we can't seem to justify political decentralization as a positive in and of itself from an ethical standpoint, let's look at the practical standpoint. Maybe political decentralization will somehow make it more likely that libertarianism will spread, or make it easier or more likely that states will become less oppressive. So maybe from that standpoint, we can say that yes, political decentralization would be a good thing. So what is the net effect of political decentralization? Well, it reduces the size of the particular government, but it also increases their number. So having a greater number of smaller states doesn't seem, right off the top of, just immediately, doesn't seem to necessarily mean that those states will become less oppressive. It seems like this is promoted merely on the grounds that, or mostly on the grounds that, well, it gets closer to the individual. But that doesn't reduce the problem that states are criminal institutions, and whether they are small or large, they are violating people's rights. So I think what it comes down to is supposedly it increases competition between states. For example, if the state of North Carolina, where I happen to reside, secedes from the United States, and let's say all of the states secede, and therefore I'm no longer subject to the United States federal government, there are now 50 states in my much closer vicinity that if I didn't like the state of North Carolina, then I could move to one of those other states. And because that act of political decentralization has reduced the geographical area upon which each of these states governs, it is easier for me to move to another state. I have to move a less great distance, and maybe the cultural differences won't be as great as if I had to move to another country. So overall, it would be easier for me to relocate and be subject to a more complementary state situation. And this all sounds good on the surface from a superficial standpoint, but what we have to remember is that this is not, while this may be a form of competition in a sense, this is not a free market. This is not free market competition. This is a hampered market that is subject to state intervention. And the important point to remember here is that the states are not what a state does. And to quote, I'm going to quote Rothbard on this. One of the critical features of a state is that it is a quote-unquote legal way for people to violate other people's rights. So what Rothbard said was, I believe it was in his essay, The Anatomy of the State, he said, the state is the legal, orderly, systematic channel for the predation of private property. So what that means is that each state is an institution that allows a legal channel for the violation of other people's rights. So that is the critical feature upon which all of these states are going to compete with each other on. So even though somebody may theoretically, it may make it easier for somebody to move to another state, it simply does not follow that the reason a person would move to another state would be for the purpose of finding a state that is more libertarian in nature. It could, because each state has the power and the ability to violate people's rights, people are now able to more easily move to other states for the purpose of finding a state that will violate other people's rights for their benefit. So it's a double-edged sword. Yes, people can move easier, but they can also move easier for the purpose of having a state that violates people's rights more to their advantage. So I don't see how if you look at it from a perspective of, well, political decentralization, it really increases the competition among states and people can vote with their feet and go to another state. Well, this is true, but again, there's the downside to that. People can move to other states for the purpose of finding states that are more likely to violate people's rights for their benefit, and this could lead to competition among the states for the purpose of increasing the violation of people's rights for the advantage of certain groups of people that they wish to attract to that state. It simply does not follow that people will necessarily move to other states for the purpose of that state being more libertarian in nature. And there's another thing to consider. As a state gets smaller, if you're familiar with public choice theory, where public choice, one of the things that is looked at is how private groups may petition and lobby, and in that petition and lobby the government to change its actions, to change its policies and actions. What happens is there is a certain cost involved with, a certain initial cost involved with reaching a certain level of influence within the government to be able to actually affect how the government governs people and to be able to reap the rewards of that. So the larger the state is, the higher that initial cost is. So for a large state such as the United States, the only people who can really meet that cost are large corporations and other large-scale lobbying institutions like maybe the AARP or things of that nature. So what happens when you increase the number of states and reduce their size is that initial cost is reduced, and that means that the ability to influence the state will be spread out among a greater number of the population, a greater percentage of the population. So more people will be able to influence the government in order to potentially use it to violate people's rights for their advantage. Now, I don't necessarily think that this means that a greater number of smaller states is worse than a smaller number of larger states. I'm simply pointing out the downside that you don't necessarily hear very often when people get all gung-ho for political decentralization. All I'm saying is that it isn't apparent. It is not apparent that there would be a good outcome from political decentralization. Maybe after more analysis, maybe there's some quantitative studies that could be done on this. What I would think would be the most likely outcome is there would be greater variance among states as far as what sorts of regulations they engage in, or how they govern their areas, because of their smaller size and the ability for a greater percentage of people to actually influence these particular governments. But beyond that, I don't see how any of this necessarily leads to a situation where there is more freedom for the general population. As far as I can tell, it simply changes the mechanics of how the government oppresses people, and maybe changes the structure a little bit of how these smaller states violate people's rights. So, at least so far, from the practical standpoint, I don't see any compelling reason to support political decentralization in and of itself. It doesn't seem to be a viable, positive end in and of itself so far. Another way of looking at this from the practical standpoint is to consider the idea that, well, perhaps political decentralization and movements which promote political decentralization will help along the way as far as convincing people of the libertarian position of eliminating the government altogether, that the government should not exist, that this supposed sovereignty or authority should be taken down to the individual level and can only be collected in group form through the voluntary consent of everybody within that group, as opposed to the state, which uses aggressive violence to get people to act in that collective manner. So perhaps political decentralization by making the government smaller and getting it, from that sense, getting it closer to the individual, maybe that will help make the argument, that will help convince people of this. Well, I don't see how this is necessarily true. In fact, most people will accept political decentralization down to a certain point, and then beyond that, they simply don't want to hear about it. Like, for example, they don't like the UN, but they love the US government, so they won't go beyond that. Or maybe you could convince them of having states secede, but beyond that, they won't agree to it. And the reason why that is so is because the argument for political decentralization and the justification for it is not the same as the arguments and justification for eliminating all government whatsoever. In fact, once you take it down once you try to make that leap from a politically decentralized system to a system of no government, people just seem to go into a state of almost cognitive dissonance in that they simply can't accept it. And again, that is because the arguments and justification for the two things are not the same. You have to explain private property rights and self-ownership and libertarian ethics, and you have to apply them consistently to people as individuals. When you make the political decentralization argument, you are still dealing in the realm of collectives. You're still dealing with people in collective units, and you have not made the jump from collective to individual. So you simply are not making it. It's almost like people seem to think that by arguing for more political decentralization, they can slip in anti-government, they can slip in the anti-government aspect of things in through the back door without people noticing, and they'll just accept it because, oh, well, I'm willing to accept the state of North Carolina seceding from the United States. I'll just go ahead and make the jump to, okay, well, everybody can secede from everything, and therefore there should be no government, no states at all. I don't see how that can be. I don't see how that really follows, because when they accept political decentralization, they are accepting the idea of a state. They are accepting the idea of the government. They have not rejected that idea, and it does not take the acceptance. You do not need to accept libertarian ethics and libertarian property rights in order to accept political decentralization. And again, that's because the arguments and justification are different for these things. So you're not getting people closer to accepting the idea of no government or the idea of complete freedom and liberty. You're simply arguing for something that in some superficial manner seems to more closely resemble what things might look like if we did accept libertarian property rights and ethics and eliminate the government. So even from that standpoint, and I want to be clear here, I'm not necessarily arguing that it makes things worse as far as the argument goes. I'm simply saying that I see no compelling reason to feel that political decentralization and arguing for political decentralization makes arguing for freedom and the elimination of government any easier. I don't see how there's any compelling reason to believe that. So I just want to be clear. I'm examining things from the standpoint of, is there a compelling reason to promote and agree with political decentralization in and of itself? And so far, I can't seem to find one when I examine things, and when I really look at them and analyze them. I'm just not seeing the reasoning. There is one other thing that I would like to talk about as far as political decentralization goes from a practical standpoint. Maybe it would make wars between states less likely. So you go from a standpoint of larger states governing larger geographic regions and governing a larger group of people, to smaller states that are over smaller geographic regions and govern a smaller group of people. Maybe that would lead to less warfare among people. Maybe the fact that a larger state can draw upon a larger tax base and create larger armies and larger, more advanced and large-scale weapon systems. That might mean that it will become more warlike. Well, that may be true, but again, there's always the opposite way of looking at things, and that is, well, a smaller number of states, a larger number of small states means that there are many more combinations for those states to come into conflict with each other. And I think at this point it is also very important to remember that if you engage in political decentralization and there are a greater number of smaller states, if those states engage in treaties with each other, let's say there's 50, the United States becomes 50 states. The 50 states secede. Now there are 50 states instead of one, and there's not one overarching federal government. Well, let's say that those 50 states decide to engage in a peace treaty, either explicitly or implicitly. They engage in a policy of no aggression towards each other. Well, the important thing to remember here is this is a de facto centralization of political authority. For smaller states to engage in any sort of agreement with each other de facto centralizes that authority to a higher and larger level. So you can't simply say, well, that'll make it more likely for smaller states will be more likely to engage in treaties. Well, again, that doesn't necessarily follow that they would be more likely to engage in these treaties. And even if they did, those treaties represent a form of political centralization. So even from this standpoint, it doesn't look like, again, there's really, I'm not finding any compelling reason to jump on the political decentralization bandwagon in and of itself. I don't see how it would necessarily make it more likely to convince people of libertarian principles or help spread libertarianism. And I don't see how it would necessarily reduce the amount of warfare among states. Again, I don't want to say that I think it would increase the amount of warfare among states because I don't know. What I'm saying is I don't see any compelling reason one way or the other. I think that there are arguments and counter arguments on both sides, and most likely as how it would play out in real life as far as warfare goes probably would just depend on the given circumstances of the given population that secedes from the larger state. So I'm not finding, again, any compelling reason even for the reduction in the amount of warfare. It may reduce the amount of warfare, it may increase the amount of warfare, or, and this is my gut feeling, is that it probably will have a negligible and insignificant effect on the amount of warfare, and will most likely have a negligible and insignificant effect on the ability to convince people of libertarian principles. So from the standpoint of practicality, I really don't see any compelling reason to favor political decentralization. So in conclusion here, I think that after looking at things from a theoretical, ethical standpoint and from a practical, real-world standpoint, I'm not seeing any justification in either sense for libertarians to as a default position to support political decentralization. I think that the base default position, again, based on my personal analysis, which I've outlined in this video, is one of neutrality. And it seems like whether a particular act of political decentralization is a positive or negative thing should be assessed on a case-by-case basis according to the criteria of whether that particular political decentralization will actually reduce the size and scope of government authority over people. And in many cases, in fact, most, if not all cases, I don't see how this really bears out. It seems like in pretty much all cases, the authority simply shifts from one group of people to another. It's not actually reduced in any sense. So again, it would seem like the base default position would be one of neutrality, and the assessment should be done on a case-by-case basis. I think that the problem here stems as far as why this is this, and there are other things, but I'm simply speaking strictly about political decentralization. Why something like this is promoted? I think the problem is that it seeks to use political means to end politics. And also it seems like it's an attempt to reduce the state indirectly. So political decentralization doesn't in and of itself make a society or area more compatible with libertarianism or make it more libertarian. But it seems like people seem to think that it will somehow indirectly make it more libertarian. But by the issue here is that by doing this indirectly, you're simply not accomplishing anything. You're not making progress towards the goal. And it also seems like, and I kind of see this in other areas, that it seems like the idea here is that you can reduce the state not necessarily by actually reducing its authority or reducing its ability to violate people's rights, but if you simply alter the structure of states, if you alter the structure of the state apparatus some by maybe, okay, we used to have one big state, now we've got multiple smaller states, or maybe you can, and other ways of looking at this is by more other examples of simply changing the structure of the government apparatus as well. You know, we can limit voting to property owners, you know, stuff like that. Or you can change how representatives and senators are elected, maybe not make them subject to direct vote, or, you know, things along those lines. But the problem is none of those structural changes alter the nature of the government, and they don't actually touch how widespread the government's oppression is. It still makes the government will still have the same authority that it had previously. It'll simply have a different structure. So as long as that authority, which is illegitimate, exists, the government will use that authority to take advantage of people and violate their rights, and to do so for the purpose of its own benefit and the benefit of those politically connected people who influence it. And the mere fact that, well, you can change the structure of the government and that will change who has influence over the government, that simply doesn't change the fact that the government is still a criminal enterprise and it is still violating people's rights. So I don't see how, I'm not finding any compelling reason to favor this sort of political decentralization just as an end in and of itself. I think that if you want to reduce the power of the government and the size and the scope of the government, those things must be taken on directly and not not the indirect by the back door method. You have to directly engage in actions that reduce the power that the government has, or the other alternate, another way of doing this is to create markets outside of the government's authority, and things along those lines. Like try to create an underground, what I'm talking about here is agorism. The idea of creating social networks and markets that exist outside of the government's purview, and to work to expand those things so that the scope of daily life that is not subject to government authority continues to increase. And hopefully, and this again, the hope is that this will ultimately, once enough people are involved with this, and the scope of life that is outside of government authority becomes great enough that eventually, there will be enough people that involved in it and that agree with it and that have signed on to it, that the government can eventually be eliminated. So what that critical mass is as far as the percentage of people, I don't know. But the bottom line is, I don't see how you're going to reduce the size of or eliminate entirely the government's authority and rights violations by trying to do it indirectly, in a manner that simply changes the superficial structure of the government. And I would place, based on my analysis in this video, I would place the idea of promoting political decentralization in and of itself as an end in and of itself, as something to be promoted without question. I would place that in that category. I think that these things need to be examined on a case-by-case basis, but overall I just don't see, I'm not finding any compelling reason to jump on board with it. At a minimum, any political decentralization should be subject to analysis and decisions made upon the circumstances and facts of that particular instance. So this is pretty much what I wanted to say on this topic. This is just kind of, like I said earlier in the video at the beginning, for many, many years I accepted the idea of political decentralization being a net positive, pretty much uncritically. And again, like recently I've just been thinking about this topic, and I just thought, well, you know what, some of this isn't making sense, and I don't know whether I really find this convincing anymore. So just decided to get in front of the camera and, put these thoughts out there, and hopefully if you're watching this somewhere, you found them interesting, and maybe this will give you a different way of looking at things, whether you're convinced by what I have to say or not. It's great. Whichever way is fine, as long as, maybe you can think about things in a different way. So anyway, this is, again, Jason from Liberate Raleigh. This has been a Liberate Raleigh video on the topic of political decentralization. Hope you enjoyed it, found it interesting, and I will see you in the next video. Have a great day.